Hello and welcome. I'm Karen Caffenteris, Associate State Director for AARP here in Michigan, and I'm very happy that you're joining us today for our presentation on planning your spring and summer garden. I don't know if you're like me. If you're joining us, you probably are. I can't wait to get out and dig in the dirt. We've had some really nice days lately, and I have done a little preliminary work, and my back feels it. But we have some guests with us today that are going to be helping us learn what to do and answer your questions. Before we get to that, I want to go over how, if you have questions, how do you ask them? You can put your questions in the comment section on either Facebook or YouTube. And we will get to those at the end. We'll answer all the questions at the end. And don't worry, we'll try to stay on as long as we need to answer as many of them as possible. If you like this event and you want to rewatch it, you can rewatch it immediately on Facebook, or in a couple of days, you can go to the AARP Michigan Virtual Events page, and there'll be an on-demand link to watch it again there. And on that AARP Michigan Virtual Event page, which you can find by going to www.aarp.org/MI, so the AARP Michigan website. And right at the top that says AARP Michigan Virtual Events, just click on that, and it will take you to the Virtual Events page. And it's all of our upcoming events for the next month or two, and then many of our recent past events that are available for on-demand watching. And there are all kinds of great things on there. We have wonderful events coming up. So now I would like to introduce to you Isabel Brandstrom. Hi, Isabel, and welcome. And Teresa Cooper. Welcome, Teresa. So these are our two experts here. Isabel is going to be doing the heavy lift today. Isabel is the MSU Extension Consumer Horticulture Educator. Say that 5 times. She's based in Hingham County, where she educates gardeners about plants and the environment. She was born in South Florida and received her undergraduate degree in horticulture science from the University of Florida in Gainesville. She then ventured north to study horticulture and receive her master's degree from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. When Isabel isn't thinking, reading, or speaking about plants, she's probably sewing. We also have Teresa Cooper. Teresa is an advanced master gardener, and she has received her certificate from MSU Extension in 2014. Gardening is a passion of hers, and she loves learning from other gardeners and sharing what she knows. She often says, gardening is a lifelong adventure. She volunteers at AARP Michigan at local public gardens, such as the Parkwood Y in Hazlet, and at the Resource Center for the Lansing Food Bank. So we're so glad to have you here today. We are, Teresa and I will be leaving the screen, and Isabel will do the presentation, and then you will see Teresa again in a little while. So take it away, Isabel.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me and Teresa here today. I am happy to be here and happy to be thinking about things warming up and getting ready to plant. So today we are going to be talking about planning, which is a key piece. So making a plan and then planting your summer and spring gardens. So it's that planning piece, like I said, is really important because it's really helpful to think about, what you want to plant, where you want to plant it, and all of that ahead of time to hopefully save yourself some time and some heartbreak and some money later on. So the outline of what we are going to be covering today is, first off, making that plan. So thinking about what you want to plant, when you want to plant, and then also where you want to plant. So doing a little bit of site evaluation. Then we're going to get into actually planting. So talking about either transplanting. So that's when you plant, like in this picture up here, you plant some, baby plants, small seedlings, starts, some people call them, or you can direct seed. We'll talk about spacing and watering and all that good stuff. And then we'll also talk about disease and pest prevention, which is a really important one to think about ahead of time, because if you work on sort of preventative maintenance, these pests and diseases can be a little bit less of a headache, which I think we all appreciate. So first, we're going to talk about making a plan. And so the first thing to think about is what you want to plant. So the thing I always say is plant what you like, and also what you're going to use. So this is in regards to vegetables or flowers. You want to plant things that you are going to use, you're going to share with others, that you like to eat, so they have sort of a special purpose for you. There's also a lot of variety out there, especially in vegetables and flowers. We see lots of different sizes, different colors, different textures, different tastes. There's a lot of fun varieties to experiment with. And one of the big ones is tomatoes. So there's a lot of tomatoes out there. And I wanted to ask everybody who is tuning in today if you all have a favorite tomato variety. So I'll give everybody a few moments to maybe type your favorite tomato variety into the comments or the chat. And then hopefully we can share some of those out. So I know one I really like, it's a classic, Roma tomatoes. And then another one of my favorites is this light blue, I think it's called the Blue Moon tomato. And April Fools, everybody, this is a total joke. This tomato does not exist. But I still want to hear what some people's favorite tomato varieties are. I had to take advantage of April Fool's Day to trick some people into thinking this tomato might exist, but no way, this is not a real tomato. So I'll give everybody a few more minutes so I can hear some favorites. And again, this is not a real tomato. April Fools. I was very excited to be able to give this presentation on April Fool's Day. Okay, so we have some heirloom. Nice. Yeah, heirloom. There's a ton of varieties. There's really fun like purple colors, those deep dark purples, Roma, beefsteak, Amish, early girl. Yeah, there's so many types out there. Thank you so much for putting some of your favorites in the chat for us. Big Boy, San Marzano. Yeah, classics, and sort of those trustworthy varieties. So my joke, another key piece to all this variety out there is you have the opportunity to grow what works in your space. So for some of us, we might not have sort of a large plot to plant with different varieties, different vegetables, but we might have some containers. We might have a porch that gets good sun and we can plant containers. This variety here is called the Tumbling Tom. This is a real variety, not one of my fake ones. And so having that opportunity to work or to plant what is going to work in your space, again, if you only have containers, there's varieties out there that do really well in sort of those patio containers, and looking for those types of varieties. Another example is sunflowers. I think a lot of us are used to, those 8-foot, 10-foot varieties out there, but there's a lot out there that you can actually grow in containers. And there's different dwarf varieties of sunflowers, also some different flowers like marigolds. Queen Sophia is one of my favorite marigolds. That's a dwarf variety. It looks excellent in containers. So knowing that there are different types of plants out there that can work in whatever sort of space you have, I think is sort of empowering and exciting. And then also knowing that there's resistant cultivars out there. So in this picture, this is a cucurbit. So maybe a lot of us sort of face different powdery mildews, downy mildews, and tomatoes. We see a lot of early blight, late blight. There are cultivars out there that are resistant to those diseases, especially for a lot of our annual vegetables and crops. And this is great because by purchasing a resistant cultivar, you can really save yourself a lot of time and a lot of money because you're not going to have to focus on how to control these different diseases in the garden. So also keeping in mind that there are resistant cultivars out there. So when do I plant? There's a few things that you need to determine before you start to plant and trying to figure out when you should plant. So the first one is to determine if what you're planting is a cool season or a warm season crop. Then you have to decide if you want to direct seed. start your seeds indoors and then plant out as transplants, or if you just want to buy transplants from the local garden center. All of these are, viable options. It's just going to depend on what sort of system you have, where you want to spend your time and your resources. So we'll go through the different aspects of direct seeding, transplanting, and things like that. And one really key piece to figuring out a lot of these answers about when to plant is using seed packets. And that is really helpful if you're starting your seeds indoors, because a lot of information is there. But a lot of seed companies will have information on their websites too. So if you know the cultivar that you're going to grow, you can totally look up information about that specific cultivar on the web. So cool season crops. These are crops that like sort of 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit for soil temperature. Soil temperature is really important because along with air temperature, but soil temperature is going to influence how those plants establish themselves and get their roots settled in so they can really, prep themselves and set yourself up for success. So cool season crops, like that 40 to 50 degree range. There are a few different options for direct seeding. So peas, lettuces, spinach, kale, carrots, and beets. Some of us might be thinking about direct seeding these pretty soon. And then there's some other species out there. So broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and kohlrabi are good options to start indoors. And I'll back up a second. So when I say direct seeding, what I mean is you are taking the seeds and planting them directly into the ground where you want the plants to grow. Versus starting indoors, you're going to plant those seeds in a tray. Often we use grow lights, heat mats, and grow them up into these transplant form to then plant outside in your plot or where you want those plants to grow. Starting indoors can be helpful because it gives you sort of a way to jump ahead. You're starting these plants in a more controlled environment. It kind of just gives you an option to start a little bit more early. So warm season crops. These are crops that prefer 60 degrees Fahrenheit or higher soil temperatures. So we can think of a lot of our summer vegetable crops. So tomatoes, peppers, things like that. And best for direct seeding. So beans, cucumbers, and squash. These are good for direct seeding because the seeds tend to be very large. So it's just sometimes easier to just plant those directly in the ground because the seeds are so big. Cucumbers and squash, cucumbers, specifically tend to have kind of sensitive roots and they don't like to be transplanted as much. So just something to consider when you're direct seeding or transplanting, that cucumbers prefer to be direct seeded. And then you can start some of them indoors. So tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, things like that. So when do I start seeds indoors? This is the question we're probably all asking ourselves right now. Is it time? So I'm going to give you a few different tips and tricks to try and figure out when you should start your seeds indoors. So for cool season crops, what you'll do is count backwards from when the soil is usually workable. And I know that's kind of, not a specific time, but when I say the soil is usually workable, so think of if you stick a shovel or a trowel into the soil, it's not going to be frozen. You're not going to hit any sort of frozen chunks either. You want it to be consistently thawed. You want the soil to be somewhat warm, at least not frozen. You don't want the soil to be too wet. We tend to have pretty wet springs. So just counting backwards from when that soil is consistently thawed, you're not going to hit any like frozen pieces in it, and count backwards from that date. So that's when you'll start your seeds indoors for those cool season crops. And then for warm season crops, that point is a little bit more easy to determine because you're going to count backwards from our frost-free date or your frost-free date. And one thing I forgot to mention, so I'm going to skip back a little bit. When I give these sort of standards for soil temperature, one really great resource that we have at MSU is the MSU EnviroWeather site. There are a few different weather stations set up all over the state, and you can find information about your current soil temperatures through that resource. So hopefully we'll get that link in the chat, but when you're wondering, what what are my soil temperatures right now, especially for some of these cool season crops that we might get close to being able to direct seed. You can use that resource to figure out what your soil temperatures are. And again, that's the MSU EnviroWeather site. So back to when should I start warm season crops indoors? We'll count backwards from that frost-free date. So trying to figure out your frost-free date, there's a table that we have that's really helpful that we'll also put in the chat, because you can just look for where you're located and then what your frost-free date will be. But the frost-free date is going to be, when you consistently won't be expecting any frosts. So a frost is any temperature between 33 and 36 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a little bit warmer than a freeze technically, but those frosts can still damage some of that tender plant tissue. So that's why we recommend planting out after that frost-free date, so you can be sure that you're setting your warm season crops up for success and they're not going to have that frost damage. And often historical data is used to calculate this last frost date. So again, starting those warm season crops indoors, you'll count backwards from your frost-free date. So this is just a table about frost-free dates. I'm based out of Lansing, Michigan. The frost-free date here is June 12th. So I'm going to use that date to count backwards from to start my seeds indoors. And like I said, a lot of this information can be found on the seed packets. So this is just a tomato example. Look at the back of the seed packet. We think to ourselves, is this a cool season or a warm season crop? It's right there in the seed packet. So it says that warm season tender annual. So check that. We know it's a warm season crop. And then we have to think, do I want to direct seed it or do I want to start these seeds indoors? And again, right there, start seeds indoors. So check, we know we are starting these indoors. And then we have to think about timing. So when do I start these seeds indoors? And it's right there again. So start seeds 6 to 8 weeks before planting date. And then there's another note there that says set transplants out after danger of frost has passed. So this is our indication that we are going to count 6 to 8 weeks backwards from our frost-free date. So for me in Lansing, I'm sure it's different for all of us all over the state, but for me in Lansing, that June 12th date, if I count 6 to 8 weeks backwards from it, that's going to put me at April 17th to May 1st to start these seeds indoors. And then there's a lot of other good information on this seed packet. So when I'm starting these seeds indoors, I know I'm starting them, let's see, around April 17th, I think it was. There's also information about the seeding depths, so how deep I should plant them in the trays, what temperature they germinate best at and should be held at, so 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. We're not going to get too deep into seed starting in this talk, but I just wanted to point out all this good information. If you are starting seeds indoors sometime soon, refer to your seed packet for all of this information about how to really set yourself and your seeds up for success. So this warm season crop, the seeds and the seedlings like to be held around that 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So I might use something like a heat mat to start these, because in the conditions in my apartment, they certainly aren't 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then days to germinate, 7 to 14. So we know we can expect it, we can be expecting those seeds to germinate, within 2 weeks, a week to 2 weeks. It's also, these seed packets are also great because some seeds do need light to germinate. So a lot of lettuce seeds need light to germinate, and you can often find that information on the seed packets. So I'm really trying to get at, don't throw away your seed packets because lots of good info there. And so just to reiterate, when you plant or start your seeds is going to depend on if it's a warm season or a cool season crop, if you're going to be starting it indoors or direct seeding or buying transplants at the garden center. And then another key piece I wanted to point out is, it's going to depend on what your soil is like. So I mentioned earlier that sometimes we get really wet springs and we can have this really kind of not this soggy, this is kind of exaggerated, but I want everybody to think about, that soggy soil. And if you plant seeds and direct seed into that soggy soil, there's a good chance that it's going to be too much water for those seeds. They're going to rot. They're not going to grow well. So really starting in direct seeding when we have not the sort of soggy, cold, wet soil. And again, plants don't really thrive in this wet, soggy soil. So checking your soil is really important before direct seeding some of those cool season crops. And then the next piece is, where do I plant? So for a lot of our, warm season annuals, a lot of them prefer full sun. And that means about 6 to 8 hours of sun per day. There are some of those cool season crops that might need, can do well in sort of dappled sun. But in general, looking for a space or a site with that full sun is ideal because you want to put those plants in a place where they are going to get the sun that they need to photosynthesize and to be big and healthy and strong and produce fruit so we can then eat, right? You want to make sure there's water nearby that's going to be available. Sometimes I rely on milk jug watering, which I know for a lot of us is certainly not ideal. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of arm lifting. So making sure there's a water source nearby, and that's going to fit, your goals and, how much work you want to do to get water to the site is going to be really important. And then understanding your soil. So, the soil structure, the soil type, the current fertility is going to be really important. And that's where having a soil test can be really helpful. You want to make sure it's well drained. Again, because plants tend to not really, a lot of our, summer annuals do not thrive in that wet, soggy soil. So making sure your site is well drained, being mindful of different plants that in the area that might pose sort of competition for your plants. I think a lot of times of like tree roots, things like that. Definitely don't get rid of the tree roots, but just be mindful that there might be an element of competition. And competition for sun too. You might have sort of shading at this site too. I know a lot of our deciduous trees have not leafed out yet. So if you're doing a site evaluation, be sure to keep in mind what that site looks like in summer when those trees are fully leafed out, because it might be shadier than what you expected. And then containers are also an option too. So if you don't have, a large plot like this, there's still a lot of options for containers to grow in to put on your porch or your patio and things like that. And you can still get some vegetables or flowers during the summer. And containers are nice too, in my opinion, because you can move them around. So helpful. And we like to suggest, don't guess soil tests. So this comes into play when you're thinking about soil fertility and how you might fertilize. Soil tests can give you the exact status of your soil. And then the MSU soil test will give you recommendations based on the exact status of your soil. So you're not over applying, you're not under applying. We want to make sure we are applying the exact amount that we need to our planting sites. So now we're going to get into planting. So planting, how you plant is going to be affected by if you have started transplants inside, if you bought transplants, or if you're going to direct seed. So when, in terms of sort of plant development, when to sow or transplant outside, one key piece I like to mention is making sure your transplants have their true leaves. So true leaves are sort of that second set of leaves that seedlings will get. I know when you see a seed germinate, you often see sort of these two leaves come out. In this picture, hopefully you guys can see my mouse. It's these kind of like two heart-shaped leaves. Those are the cotyledons, or the seed leaves. And so those aren't the true leaves. What we're looking for is this sort of second set of leaves. And that's a good indication that, it's okay to transplant outside. Sometimes we have our transplants inside for a longer period of time and they have more than one set of true leaves. That's totally okay too. But I just want to recommend not transplanting your seedlings outdoors when they sort of just have those two cotyledons. They are a little bit too small. They probably aren't going to make it very well. You want to make sure they're a little more developed before you transplant them outside. And so when, in terms of time of year, for warm season crops, we will transplant or sow them outside after the risk of frost has passed. So again, after your frost-free date. For cool season, you can direct seed and transplant outside as soon as the ground can be worked in spring. Cool season crops are great because you can start, about like the midsummer, end of summer, you can start thinking about preparing a second crop for fall harvest. And I think I have another talk with AARP coming up, and we'll talk about planting your garden for a fall harvest. But cool season crops are great because you have that early season and then that late season option too, when we're moving into sort of moving out of these colder temperatures and then moving into these cooler temperatures. Again, back to my beloved seed packet. A lot of this information about when to transplant outside can be found on the seed packet. So again, back to this tomato, they suggest transplanting outside after the danger of frost has passed. And again, that's because you want to make sure those warm season crops aren't going to have any sort of frost damage. If we think about those warm season crops, they thrive at warmer temperatures. They aren't, adapted or ready to sort of take the stress of frost. So we want to make sure we're setting them up for success. We might have to be a bit patient, waiting for our frost-free date. I know that can be a challenge, waiting for that frost-free date, but it really helps you set yourself up for success and making sure your plants are going to do well. And it also saves you from some heartbreak if we get one of those late season frosts, and it might toast some of your transplants outside. So that's an important piece. And then hardening off. So this is something that we suggest, again, because plants really like to acclimate to conditions. So hardening off is when you take your transplants and set them outside about a week ahead from when you're going to actually plant them in the ground. You can start putting them outside for about 1 hour in the sun, and then increase that 1 more hour every day. So on the first day, you'll just put them outside in their containers or trays or whatever, leave them outside for an hour. The next day, you'll do it for 2 hours. The next day, you'll do it for 3 hours, and just slowly increase the amount of time that they're spending outside. And that will really help them sort of slowly adjust to outside conditions and acclimate and sort of be ready for those conditions when you put them in the ground. If you are purchasing transplants at a garden center, my best guess is that they're probably already hardened off. A lot of garden centers will leave their plants outside, but this is a key piece if you are starting your transplants indoors. Plants really like to acclimate to conditions. They don't like it, if you take them from one condition to an entirely different outdoor condition. They like to slowly acclimate and kind of get themselves ready. So when you are planting your transplants and picking the transplants that you're going to plant, it's really important to look for healthy plants. So this could be in the transplants that you started indoors. Sometimes we start more than we actually need. So picking the ones that look particularly healthy, or if you are buying transplants at a garden center, making sure you're looking for the healthy ones. So inspect the leaves, the stems, and the roots. Make sure there's no sort of like soft areas. They're not wilting. They don't have any spots, and you don't see any insects or insect damage. Making sure they are sort of short and stocky. You don't want to go for the transplants that are sort of like leggy or stretched out. And also making sure that they don't have flowers or fruit. Sometimes that is a sign of stress. A lot of these transplants are being held in sort of these smaller containers, and they just don't have the space that they need to grow, and they can get a bit stressed out. And they're like, oh man, I got to make my fruit, so I can make my seeds and reproduce myself, right? So seeing those flowers or those fruit can sometimes be a sign of stress. And I recommend avoiding transplants that might have flowers or fruit on them already. And then for direct seeding, so instead of transplanting, if you are direct seeding, can be advised for some plants. And it's really important to, when you're direct seeding, pay attention to the spacing. So seed packets and instructions will have different ways that they try to advise you to direct seed. So two of the most common ones are furrow planting. So that's when you'll create sort of one long furrow and then put, it might say seed 20 seeds per foot. So you're going to put 20 seeds per foot. And then you're going to have to go back and thin those. Usually on seed packets and directions, they'll say thin to, I don't know, 1 plant per 4 inches or something like that. So making sure you're going back to thin those plants is important. Some instructions will have you put multiple seeds per hole. Again, you're going to go back and thin those plants. If you have, I know my sunflower packet last year, it was 2 seeds per hole, but I had to go back if both of those germinated and remove one of them. So just being sure if you're direct seeding that you are going back to thin those plants. And we'll get to the importance of thinning very soon and spacing very soon. Sometimes succession plantings are an option depending on what you're planting. So that means you will plant one crop and then soon after plant another crop. So you can have one harvest now and then another harvest in 2 weeks. So some greens that do really well with succession plantings are arugula, basil, cilantro, some vegetables, things like bush beans, radishes, carrots, beets, a lot of those root crops. The radishes in this picture are, I believe, the French breakfast radish. They have like a 20 days to maturity because they're very small radishes, but these are great because you can get, a number of plantings per season. Also, they're very cute and very tasty. So knowing that there are some plants out there that you can do succession plantings to get multiple harvests per season. And again, it's going to depend on the days to maturity. So like I said, those French breakfast radishes are 20 days. So as soon as you direct seed them in the ground, 20 days from that date, they're going to be harvestable. So that's a pretty short window. And so you can get multiple of those plantings in. And spacing is so important. And one quote that I've heard before is begin with the end in mind. So we're out in our gardens, we're super excited. We have more transplants than we actually need, and we want to get them all on the ground because, look at these tiny things, these like 5-inch transplants. There's no way they're going to end up, as like 4-foot plants, but they will. So I have this tomato example up here. These tiny, tiny transplants in the ground end up as this jungle mass. And so spacing is really important because we want to have airflow between our plants. We want to make sure our plants have enough space to get to their mature size without too much competition. And that airflow is super important because a lot of pathogens and diseases will thrive in sort of hot, warm, humid conditions that could develop in sort of this tomato jungle. A lot of pathogens love those conditions, but airflow will help keep things a little bit cooler. It's going to keep those spores and those pathogens moving through, just create less and less ideal environment for pathogens to kind of take root. So back to the trusty seed packet. There's a lot of information about spacing as well. So you can see plant spacing, 12 to 24 inches, and then row spacing is 4 feet. So we'll get into these two different types of spacing. So remember, there was that plant spacing, and then there was that row spacing. So for plant spacing, that's going to be the space between each plant. So you can see in this sort of illustration, you want 12 to 24 inches between each plant. And then we have the row spacing. So if you're going to have multiple rows of the same plant, you want the space between the rows to be 4 feet. And that's often so you can walk between the rows, usually really, really important, so you can get in there and harvest. So making sure your plants are well spaced out and the rows are well spaced out, again, to help that airflow and help prevent diseases. And one thing I'll mention too is, I mentioned it earlier, but I just want to bring it back up because I keep bringing up this picture of seed packets. If you are buying transplants, just figure out what the cultivar of the plant you are using is, and then you might have to do a little bit research to get the information about spacing online. But a lot of seed companies will have that information online. So as long as you know that, like, I'm growing this Brandywine tomato, I can look at a few different seed companies' websites to see if they will have tips about transplanting. And then some other notes about planting. Make sure you water after you plant. This is really important for establishment of your plants. It helps them, give those roots the water they need to get established. And especially if you're planting around June, if that's your frost-free date, we might have pretty warm, sunny days. And just making sure your plants have water after you plant them is really important. And as they grow through the season, to avoid any sort of stress. And then another thing I will mention is if you have your transplants out on that, hot, sunny day, I would recommend putting them in the shade to keep them a little bit cooler, just so they aren't totally stressed out in these small containers sitting in the sun with no water. Just kind of tucking them into the shade while you are transplanting them out can sometimes really help. And then also teasing out the root ball. So when you pull out your transplant, you might see that the roots are wrapped around. What you want to do is just tease that out a little bit because you don't want those roots to continue growing in that circular round pattern. You want to make sure you tease them out so they can kind of spread themselves. Okay, and preventing pests and diseases. I'm sure this is exciting, and again, what I like to bring up and encourage is this sort of preventative maintenance. So thinking about things ahead of time so you can prevent them from happening. So back to watering, it's really important to avoid watering the foliage. You want to water at the base of plants. Some people will use drip irrigation. Again, that slow, steady stream at the base of a plant. Watering the foliage will, once again, and has the potential to provide this environment that's ideal for pathogens to kind of settle and take over. It helps build up this humid environment. So you just want to make sure that you are watering at the base of your plant. Spacing. Again, this is making sure that your plants are properly spaced out. So there's that airflow between them, again, to reduce the chances that you're going to have this warm, humid environment where pathogens are just going to take hold. So making sure you have enough space for air to move through, for things to cool off, can be really helpful with preventing diseases. And then resistant cultivars. I can't uplift resistant cultivars enough. So in this picture, these are both different tomatoes. The one on the left, I believe, has early blight. The one on the right has fusarium wilt. There's cultivars out there that are resistant to both of these diseases. And one thing I'll say too is if you have taken notes from your garden last year and you know that fusarium wilt was an issue for you, going into the next season, you can choose a resistant cultivar. I might also suggest planting in a different site as well, but you can use your experience and what you've learned each season to kind of guide what sort of plants you're going to grow. And that can be really helpful. Again, saves you time, saves you money because you don't have to buy the tools to try and manage these diseases. It saves you heartbreak from losing your plants. Of course, gardening is perpetually learning from your mistakes, but resistant cultivars are a good option, especially if you know that you have had to battle a particular disease in previous years. Crop rotation. So like I mentioned on that last slide, I might consider planting tomatoes in a different location if you did have something like late blight the next year. Crop rotation can be really important with managing pests as well, so insects. In this picture on the left, these are Mexican bean beetles. Those pests will overwinter very close to the site where those bean plants were. So moving bean plants to a different location the next year can be really helpful because they are a distance from that pest that might be overwintering there. And it can just kind of lessen the chances of having that pest again. The image on the right, I believe, is a type of agrobacterium, which is a soil-borne pathogen. It might be best to just leave a site fallow or plant, something like a cover crop, something that you aren't particularly attached to, don't want to harvest from, to kind of let that pathogen sort of work itself out in that site. So considering crop rotation can be really important and helpful to prevent and manage diseases. And again, knowing sort of the different pathogens or pests that you maybe had to face in previous years can really help guide these decisions. So if you want to rotate crops, if you want to choose resistant cultivars, keeping a garden diary, a garden journal can be really helpful, just so you can recall, what happened in past years. And then another thing I want to bring up is that we often have beneficials in the gardens too. So the image here is a tomato hornworm that has been infected by a parasitoid wasp. And I know it's a little bit like it has that ick factor, but we do have these beneficial insects in the garden too. And one thing that is really important about this sort of preventative maintenance, choosing resistant cultivars and things like that, is whatever we spray or use to really manage these pathogens or insects can also affect other insects in the garden and other beneficials. So if we do the research and sort of try and take the time to plan ahead and do our best to prevent different pests, it can also help us protect these beneficials because maybe we don't have to spray as much. And not to mention, it can help us save time and money not having to buy those sprays. So this preventative maintenance can be really helpful for us sort of supporting a lot of our beneficial insects as well. And again, sorry for the ick factor, but it is really neat, these wasps. And then keep your plants healthy. So kind of like humans, building up this immune system, keeping ourselves healthy is the first line of defense often. So we can tolerate something like a cold and then recover. Same thing for plants. Keeping them healthy, well watered, well fertilized and properly fertilized in the proper site can help them, be able to handle something like some pest damage and then recover from it. So just making sure that you are keeping your plants healthy, you're watering, they're in the right site for them, and things like that can really be that first line of defense and help them tolerate different pests and diseases that might, create a little bit of an aesthetic issue, but really aren't affecting overall plant health. And then mulch. Mulch is an excellent tool in the garden. Mulch can help prevent weeds in the garden. It can help retain moisture in the garden. For a lot of the diseases, I know septoria is a big one, where if water hits the ground and then splashes up, again, it creates that sort of moist, humid environment where that septoria can take off. If you are watering with mulch, you're less likely to get sort of that splash up onto the plant. So mulch has a lot of great uses in the garden, again, to retain moisture, prevent weeds, prevent that sort of splash up that might lead to different pathogens taking hold. Can't say enough about mulch. There's a lot of different types out there. This is pine straw mulch. There's, wood chips and things like that. Lots of options out there for mulch, but an excellent tool in the garden. And some people even use sort of like old leaf litter, mowed up leaf litter. A lot of options out there for mulch. And then choosing the right plant for the right place. So in regards to our spring and summer garden, this can really apply to making sure our plants are getting are in a site that is going to receive full sun and an appropriate soil. Again, so they're in this proper site. They have, the resources they need. They have the sunlight they need to grow. Can really help set themselves up for success and be healthy plants in the first place. If you plant a tomato in the shade, it is probably not going to thrive. It might be more susceptible to damage from pests or diseases, things like that. So making sure you are choosing a site that is going to fit the requirements for your plants can help set themselves up for success, grow strong and healthy, be able to tolerate a little bit of damage, a little bit of disease, and still produce fruit or, flowers, whatever you want from these plants. And then some other prevention tools are physical barriers. So the picture here is row cover that we had used on some cool crops. We had radishes planted in these raised beds. And this can be really helpful for keeping pests out physically, they can't get through that row cover. I will say in the warmer months, you may have to kind of open these a little bit because things do get a little bit warmer under that row cover. So you don't want to stress your plants out by keeping them under this row cover and in too warm of a situation, but excellent for this cool season, keeping pests out. If you have trouble with cabbage loopers, could be a good option, keeping those moths out so they can't lay eggs on your brassicas, and then those eggs hatch and you get those cabbage loopers that are totally going to feed. Thinking about different physical barriers that can keep pests out. And I get a lot of questions about vertebrate animals and damage in the garden, so things like groundhogs, deer. The best tool for that, again, is these physical barriers. A fence is excellent. Usually you can use like a wire fence, and then for groundhogs, especially because they dig, sort of bending it into this L shape underground can help prevent them from digging under the fence. There's a lot of difficult or not too many super effective options for keeping vertebrate animals out. I know some people will use like repellents, but those wash away quickly. These physical barriers are, in my opinion, the best option to keep those vertebrate animals out. And then troubleshooting tips. So I know there's a lot of questions on this slide here, but it's sort of to just inspire, hopefully, a thinking process if you start to see symptoms showing up in your plants. So if you start to see yellowing or spotting, things like that, take stock of, the whole planting. So are these symptoms affecting one species of plant or many? So are they affecting your tomatoes and your cucumbers, or is it just the tomatoes? Did the symptoms develop slowly, or did they spread? Did they develop suddenly, maybe after a weather event? So if we had a few days of pretty severe drought, is that when things started showing up? Do they isolate to different plant parts or plants of a certain age or location? Can really help you sort of start that diagnostic process. And then actually looking for any actual signs of insects or diseases. So you can look around for different frass, for chewing, look for fungal spores. So flip over the leaf, see if you see any sort of like weird spotting, any sort of fungal spores. And this sort of will hopefully, taking stock of this whole situation will hopefully inspire you to wonder if it is something that is living that is causing these symptoms or something that is environmental. So I have this table up on the screen where a lot of these biotic, so living, you can think different pests or diseases, they tend to affect just one species. They tend to have progressive damage, and you often see signs. So you see frass from insects, you see spores, you see kind of weird ooze from your plants, things like that. For abiotic, so symptoms that might be caused by a less than ideal environment or some sort of weather event. You see them widespread, so not just on one species. You might see the same symptoms on your cucumbers as you see on your tomatoes. They can be sudden and for a very brief period of time. So one that I often think of is drought. You might see like a sudden browning of the tips of the leaves, but the new growth that you get, if it has enough water, might show up green and look healthy. Are they isolated? They can be isolated to different plant parts of a certain age or position. So again, for something like drought, you might see that show up on the older growth, but then once the plants have enough water, you will see healthy new growth show up. So I know diagnosing things like this can be really difficult, but I was just hoping to sort of guide your thinking, take stock of the entire planting, see if it's affecting different species, how quickly it developed, if there was a period of severe drought, or maybe even a period of really heavy rains. So we had some flooding, to try and decide if it might be biotic, if it might biotic or living, or if it might be abiotic, so something caused by the environment. And of course, MSU Extension has a lot of resources out there for troubleshooting. We have the Gardening of Michigan website, which has a lot of really helpful tip sheets and things like that. We also have the Lawn and Garden Hotline. So that is operating every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 9 a.m. to noon. You are welcome to call with your questions. I will emphasize for the Lawn and Garden Hotline, as well as Ask an Expert. Ask an Expert is our sort of like online version of the Lawn and Garden Hotline. You can submit photos and questions online using that tool as well. Sending photos is super helpful. So sending a photo from far away so we can see multiple species, sending a photo up close. So when you see that yellowing or that spotting, photos are really helpful with diagnosis, and then also catching the symptoms early on. So before, all of your tomatoes are toast, can be really helpful. So we can see, how things are progressing through the plant. So lots of resources out there for troubleshooting. If, all of the prevention and planning that you did, you still end up getting pests and diseases in the garden. That's the way it works, right? We're gardening in a huge system that is larger than us, with lots of different organisms. So we are here to help you sort of troubleshoot problems. And that is it for the presentation. I know we're going to move into questions now. And Teresa's going to pop up. I see her.
Hi. We've got some great questions. So
okay.
The first one is kind of going back to when people are planting their seeds indoors. And one question was, is a grow light better to get seeds, to make the seeds grow better, having a light?
Yeah, from my personal experience, I say yes. I have seen people sort of start seeds in like windowsills, or in an area of your house where you might have a lot of light, but it's coming from sort of that one source that isn't directly over the plants, right? So those plants are really responsive to where the light is coming from. So you can get stretching, they might stretch up towards the window, and then you kind of end up with these really leggy, sort of unhealthy looking seedlings. And so in my experience, yes, a grow light has been very helpful because you are giving them this direct source of light right over them. Usually just tends to help create a little bit of less stretchy, less like windy transplants.
Okay. How do you prevent tomato worms is one question. This person says they destroyed all their tomatoes in 1 year.
Yeah. Yep. Tomato worms are the worst. One thing I would suggest is crop rotation. So I know it might be heartbreaking, but maybe not planting tomatoes for a season, planting something else in that space for a season.
Wow.
Because those hornworms are going to overwinter in that same location. So if you try tomatoes in the same place next year, you're probably going to have the same problem. So thinking about crop rotation, maybe not planting tomatoes for a year. Again, I know if you love tomatoes, it's kind of like, I can't plant tomatoes for a year.
Right.
but in the long run, either way, you're going to have a little bit of heartbreak. So I guess it's,
right.
it's just deciding.
Another lady asked if you could recommend the best butternut squash for Michigan. Do you have any varieties?
I don't have a favorite variety. I haven't grown butternut squash. I usually just buy them at the farmer's market.
Yeah, I haven't either. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know there are some fun varieties out there. Like the honey nut is one that I know. I've never grown it, so, I don't know how it grows, but I do think it's really cute.
I know.
It's like the tiny one, so.
They're good, and they're
Yeah.
so good. This is something, this is so cool. This one comment from a viewer that she's garden royalty and she's with us today. So she's, her name is Leora, I'm probably not saying this right, Stutz, it's Stuttes. And she says she gardened many years ago, but at the time she liked Big Boy and Better Boy. They did very well for her in Michigan, in Lansing. Her garden was on the Victory Garden program in 1981, and it's available on YouTube under her name if you go to the Victory Garden 1981. And she is now 96 years old.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. That's very
yeah.
cool. Very cool. Here's a question. What's the best time to water your plants in your garden? Is there?
Yeah, I recommend early in the morning.
Okay.
So then your plants have some time to dry off before it gets like a little bit hot and warm, and you might get those sort of more humid conditions. I would recommend earlier in the morning, and again, making sure you're watering at the base of the plants and not watering the foliage.
Okay, all right. We did have a couple questions. I know you talked about it, but on keeping those darn pests out of the garden, and chipmunks. Chipmunks, the same thing.
Chipmunks can fit through things you don't expect that they can fit through. Is what I've learned.
Yeah.
I guess, you can lean into, again, row cover for those cool season crops, and just make sure you have it firmly down on the ground so they can't really get under it. But all I can think of is those physical barriers, maybe like a solid fence that they can't crawl under. They're tricky. Chipmunks are really tricky. There are some repellents out there, but again, they're not, they wash off pretty easily and don't last really long. But, if you are consistent with it, that could be an option.
Okay. We've had a couple people that asked about container gardening, and they're wondering, is there a program, or where could they go to get more information on trying container gardening?
Yeah, so Cabin Fever Conversations is another program that I run, and we had a specific program on container gardening. I would point, Karen, I see your question up there. I would point you to sort of the Gardening in Michigan website. We should have a lot of resources there. And then you could go to the Learning Online resources, and then try and find the Cabin Conversations video about container gardening. One thing I'll say that I didn't mention is for container gardening, the key piece is to make sure that you get containers with holes in them. You want to make sure they have drainage. Otherwise, it's not a container, it's a bowl, is another quote that I heard.
Good one.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one on fertilizing. What does environmentally safe fertilizing look like?
Yeah, so environmentally safe fertilizing looks like fertilizing based on a soil test. So those soil tests will tell you exactly what your current conditions are like in your soil, how much phosphorus, potassium you have, and then I think magnesium and calcium. So how the amounts of those nutrients that you have, and then what you need to apply, or should apply, and then when to apply it, and what amounts. So knowing current conditions so you don't over apply is really important, because things like phosphorus run off really easily and aren't used by the plants, and then that can infect our entire ecosystem, right? That's how we see algae kind of take off. So making sure you're putting down only what you need is sort of, in my opinion, that environmentally friendly fertilizing. And then for MSU soil tests, we give you recommendations for sort of conventional fertilizers, for organic fertilizers, and the different amounts of those types as well. So depending on what your values are, your goals, there are options in both of those as well from your soil test.
Okay, all right.
I love soil test. I just ordered mine online.
I have
And
to
we
do
do-
mine yet. I haven't.
Yeah. And so we did, one thing I'll also say, sorry, I know you're going to ask me
No,
another
it's okay.
question.
Okay.
But we recommend soil testing every 3 years.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm due. So this other lady asked, how does she protect her raised beds in the winter?
In the winter? So I guess it'll depend on, I'm assuming she's growing things in the winter.
Not sure.
Yeah, I guess I would just fall back on row cover tends to be a good option. I'm assuming the raised beds are outside. Maybe she is growing like root vegetables in late winter. These are a lot of assumptions, but it's just based on, temperature and things like that. But row cover is a pretty solid option.
Okay. What is abiotic? What does that mean?
Yeah, so abiotic essentially means non-living. So you can think of biotic, biology, without it, so non-living.
Non-living, okay.
Yeah, so in my troubleshooting examples, that's usually sort of like environmental conditions. So we can think of like rain, or flooding, drought, things like that. Those are weather patterns. They're not technically living. Something biotic would be like tomato hornworm. That's a living organism.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one question, what is frass? What does that mean?
I hope it's okay to say poop, because it's insect poop.
It's poop.
It's poop.
That's okay. I think there are several people that wondered what that was.
Okay, yeah, it's poop. It's, usually it would end up like from caterpillars. It's just kind of like these tiny brown specks. It's insect poop.
Yeah, okay.
This is like, stop saying poop, Isabel.
It's okay. I think it's fine. Here's a follow-up to the lady that asked about how to protect her raised beds. She's not growing anything in the raised bed over the winter.
Okay. I guess I'm wondering what she is trying. Sorry, this is what happens. One question, more questions, but
right.
If she's trying to protect them from critters, I would again probably use row cover. If she is trying to prevent like erosion of the soil, she could try a cover crop.
There's a lot of what ifs on that. Yeah.
Okay.
One question had something. This one lady had something eating her green beans and kale. She's not sure if it was aphids, but she's asking, what can I do to naturally get rid of them?
Yeah, so if it's aphids, if you're lucky, nature will run its course and one of those parasitoid wasps will come in and start creating aphid mummies. And so if, that is one thing that might happen as those beneficials come in and sort of start creating these aphid mummies and sort of take care of them for you. Some other options are, we tend to call those sort of the soft-bodied insects.
Okay.
You can use things like neem oil as an option. You can squish them. But I would
factor.
Yeah. Also because aphids like produce that gross honeydew.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's an option. But there are those parasitoid wasps that might come in. So you could be patient and see if that happened.
Okay. And then one other question. Can you recommend how to get rid of horse nettle in a vegetable garden?
I guess I'm not sure what horse nettle is. That's probably one that I would recommend sending a picture. So you can send a picture through Ask an Expert, and we can give you exact recommendations for horse nettle. I think that must be a common name, and I'm not sure what it is. So a picture would be most helpful.
Well, thank you, Isabel, so much for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today.
Yeah, thanks. This was fun.
Yeah. So thank you to everyone who participated online. We appreciate you joining us. And please do look at the other upcoming events that we have happening. You can go to as I said earlier before the presentation started, to the AERP virtual events website. I know there was a couple questions about whether during the event, about whether you can watch it again. And yes, you can watch it again. You can watch it again either immediately after on Facebook, and it will be on Facebook for a little while, but you can also go to that virtual events page, and you can find that by going to aerp.org/mi for the AERP Michigan website, and clicking right at the top there, you'll see AERP Michigan virtual events. That'll take you to the virtual events page. We have some great events coming up. We have join us again in July, because Isabel mentioned she was coming back in July, and she's going to be doing fall planting and preparing your garden for the winter at that point. Mm-hmm. And then we also have some other things. We have a great diabetes series that starts on May 6th with pre-diabetes, and then followed every 2 weeks for 4 sessions on different aspects of how to manage your diabetes. So look for that coming up. And otherwise, any last words, Isabel or Teresa?
No, just
I have
thank you.
Okay. Where can you get that blue tomato again? That was good. You got me. You really got me.
I looked at that and I said, "Ooh, I don't want to eat that."
I know. I did the same thing.
Really?
You got me.
I guess I wouldn't want to eat it either. Yeah, I woke up this morning and I was like, oh, "It's April Fool's Day."
Yeah. That was my last question.
Well, thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Teresa, very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.